research shows that companies led by diverse management teams tend to perform better financially, and more diverse leaders tend to hire more diverse staff. Now, that doesn't mean everything's great and all the problems have been solved. I'm sure many of you still run into resistance and outdated attitudes. This morning, among other things, we're going to talk about how to overcome some of those remaining obstacles. Leading that discussion will be Atiya Jaha-Rashidi, Director of Diversity and Inclusion at Newark Beth Israel Medical Center. She is a registered nurse and a former director of special projects at the hospital and has more than 20 years of experience leading and working on community outreach programs. Former director of clinical engagement, director of patient experience, and interim vice president of community relations. Please welcome Atiya Jaha-Rashidi.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
So the stairs were to the left. It's a pleasure to be here with this dynamic panel. I'm so excited about where we're going this morning and how we're going to engage this ever-changing and continuum of diversity and inclusion. Thank you so much, NJBIZ, for bringing me here today and inviting me to be the moderator for today. Thank you, Jeff, for the introduction. And so you heard my bio, but within that bio, what you did not hear is that I am cisgender, AFAB, and my pronouns are she, hers, and hers. That I am the CEO, founder, and president of 3 startups and 1 acquisition. Pretty impressive, huh? Thought so too. All that really means is that I have given birth to 3 children. And I'm raising my nephew. That I am Muslim. That I was born and raised in the city of Newark, where I work and play. Sort of a little bit an introvert. Wouldn't believe that if you had one conversation with me and seeing me up here today. But I tend to have some extrovert tendencies. I've had the pleasure of working at Newark Beth Israel Medical Center in Children's Hospital of New Jersey for 25 years with diverse populations, and now as the Director of Diversity and Inclusion. I have the pleasure of working with great leadership where we have support and commitment from Barry Ostrowski, our President and CEO of RWJ Barnabas Health, our Chief Diversity Officer, who is here with me today, Trina Parks, great leader in this field in our organization, and my president and CEO, Mr. Darrell K. Terry Sr. In this space, I get to work very closely to people like you and people that represent diverse communities like myself. And so what I just described to you was 7-Eleven. Anybody know what that is? Not the convenience store, right? Although on July 11th, say it. I knew it was going to come out. But getting back to the point, it's about those 7 seconds that it takes for someone to make 11 assumptions about you. So in this time that you were able to converse with someone made 11 assumptions just by what they saw, right? And so now I'd like to invoke this discussion and have a conversation where you get below the surface and have our panel introduce themselves.
Starting with me. Good morning. Hi, I'm Lloyd Freeman, and I'm a partner and the Chief Diversity Officer at Archer. Archer is the largest law firm in South Jersey. We're headquartered in South Jersey, with about 200 attorneys and 8 offices throughout the region. As Chief Diversity Officer, it is my goal really to ensure that diversity and inclusion are completely woven into the fabric of our firm. And I love saying that because that simply means that we want diversity and inclusion to be top of mind with every single decision we make at the firm. That's in our hiring process, that's in staffing our cases, that's in making our promotions, that's in our decisions as to who our clients are. Every single thing that we do as a firm, we want to make sure that diversity and inclusion are considered. That's internally, but externally facing, it's also to make sure that Archer remains a community citizen. And talking about, where you work, but also where you play, ensuring that we are supporting diverse communities and that we are also encouraging a diverse client base as well. I chair the diversity committee, of course, in my role as chief diversity officer, which also includes having the affinity groups of our firm to report to me. And that is, that there are two of them. The first is the Archer Women's Network, which of course is our affinity group for our women attorneys. And the second is LEAD, Lawyers Encouraging Archers Diversity, which is our affinity group for all of our diverse attorneys to be able to come, to do idea sharing, to network, to find mentorship opportunities, to find out how we can help grow each other's practices, really to ensure that we remain included in everything that the firm is doing. I'm uniquely poised to have the position as Chief Diversity Officer. I'm the first one for the firm, but I am a product of our firm's diversity programs. Just this year, we celebrated 20 years of my firm's diversity programs, and that includes having a number of different scholarship and mentoring offerings at area law firms. And back in, 2004, I was a scholarship recipient from Archer. So I was an Archer Diversity Scholar, and I was the first person of color to join the firm as a summer associate and come all the way through to partnership. So I am certainly proof that diversity programs do work.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Elaine Katz. I'm Senior Vice President of Grants and Communication at Kessler Foundation. We're actually a separate organization from Kessler Institute. A number of years ago, we separated, and we changed the lives of people with disabilities through rehabilitation research and also funding employment programs for individuals with disabilities. On our research side, we seek to improve cognition and mobility and work with people with stroke, spinal cord injury, traumatic brain injury to improve daily function and help them return to their lives. Our Center for Grant Making over the past 12 years has invested close to $44 million programs in New Jersey and nationally to really improve and help people with disabilities get into the workplace. We funded new business initiatives, we funded training programs, we funded job creation, but really our niche, if you will, is to be an innovative funder. So we fund those initiatives that other people will not fund that can really move that needle on employment to make that systematic change to increase diversity and include disability in diversity within corporate settings.
Good morning. My name is Armond Kinsey. I'm the Chief Diversity Officer for Atlantic Health System. New to Atlantic Health System and new to New Jersey. Recently came up from Washington, D.C., where I was the Chief Diversity Officer for Kaiser Permanente's Mid-Atlantic region. Excited to be here, excited to join this panel. I'm always excited for panels because I get to steal ideas and learn from them while I'm trying to share as well. So really excited about that. Being in healthcare, and those of you that are in healthcare can relate to the fact that we're always looking at two sides of the coin. It's our patients and then there's our employees, besides the fact that we're looking at vendors and supplier diversity and other things. But when we think about healthcare and diversity, the goal, of course, always is to make sure that we're providing equitable care across the board. And then when you flip the coin, we're looking at how are we providing equitable practices internally to all of our employees. So we're looking for new and exciting ways to deploy diversity and inclusion initiatives and to find those champions throughout the organization that can be champions and lead some of this work. So excited to be here today. Thanks for having me.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Avonia Richardson-Miller, and I'm the Director of Diversity and Inclusion with Hackensack Meridian Health. It's an honor to be here today. I want to thank you for the opportunity to serve as a panelist. And I just want to say that I've recently newly joined the Diversity and Inclusion Department at Hackensack Meridian Health. Hackensack is the largest healthcare provider in the state of New Jersey. We have 17 hospitals, about 38,000 team members. The Diversity and Inclusion Department was originally a part of the Meridian hospitals. The merger of Hackensack Meridian Health is about a little over 3 years old now. And so this year we're excited that the Diversity and Inclusion Department actually became a corporate department. So we're now a network-wide department. The role of director is new for Hackensack Meridian Health. And I have the honor to work very closely with the entire team and with our Vice President, Wayne Boatwright, who's here today supporting us. And we have the manager, Darryl Hughes, and Barbara Graham, who's our generalist. So thank you for coming out to support today. It's an exciting time at Hackensack Meridian Health. In the past, there's been a lot of focus with D&I internally on the patient side and also with the community. Now that we are a corporate network, there is a real focus on being very intentional about the strategic initiatives of D&I within the organization. And so Wayne and the team started to pull together strategic proposal last year around November, and we have had the pleasure of moving forward with a very aggressive and intentional strategic plan for D&I throughout the entire network. So we're excited to be here to learn from others and to share those ideas that we also have. Thank you very much again.
Great introductions, and it led us to hear some words like merger, business resource groups, affinity groups, supplier diversity, and how we engage. So one of my first questions I have, and I think Lloyd explained this when he did his introduction, is how did you find yourself in diversity in leading this role, or did it find you?
Wow. A little bit of both. So I've always been a hand raiser, and knowing that I was a product of diversity programming, I knew that it was seriously my moral obligation to be able to give back and be involved with some very intentional diversity efforts for our firm to increase its diversity and inclusion engagement with what I believe are the best way to diversify a law firm, which are pipeline programs. And so I would raise my hand to be involved with our recruiting, raise my hand to be involved with our summer associate program, which are essentially our interns for the firm. And over time, that hand raising turned into, okay, now that I have the summer associates who are more women and more people of color, now let me start an affinity group for them, because once I get you here, I don't want to lose you. And I understand that, it's very easy for you to look around in an environment where you don't see a reflection of yourself. The practice of law is 84% white. And so when you get a lot of people of color who are in those environments and they cannot find people who look like them, who have risen through the ranks and gotten to a leadership position, they often then flee. And so I wanted to create affinity groups to make sure that they really did feel included and that they knew that Archer was a place for them. And so by doing all of that, at some point, the president of our firm came to me and said, listen, we've got to get a role of chief diversity officer. We've always had a diversity committee, like I said, for the past 20 years, but we wanted somebody who was going to have responsibility for looking at our D&I strategic programs and initiatives every single day. And that person is you. And so again, I said, well, raise my hand. All right, here we go.
So a tap and a raise.
Yes, yes.
Anyone else?
Oh, sure. I'd be happy to talk about it. So I wanted to be on this panel because disability is not always included in the diversity discussion. I wanted to make sure I was the voice of disability, because that's most of our work. And after raising 2 young adults with disabilities, I think it's important that the workplace recognize that this is an important part of diversity and inclusion. I was talking to some before, and really mental health, which is an invisible disability, is the most prominent disability in the U.S. So it's not disability as a person in a wheelchair, a person that's just with a cognitive disability. It could be somebody who has diabetes who needs to take insulin during the day. It could be somebody with cancer who may have to go out for treatment. So I think it's a very important part of this discussion is that when we look at what traditionally is D&I populations, that we also make sure that disability is part of this discussion.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I think that I've always, whatever I've done, I've always had a spin on it from the standpoint of diversity and inclusion. So whatever role I have been in, I've had a varied background. Prior to coming to Hackensack Meridian Health, I was working with Diversity Inc. and actually loved the work that I did there. I had responsibility for benchmarking companies that were competing in the top 50 competition. And when I made the change to come to Hackensack Meridian Health, I did so because I needed to make some changes personally in my life to be able to better balance my own life. So I came in a different role as director of the child care department for JFK. In that role, I was still integrating D&I, even though we didn't have a D&I department there. I had an amazing boss that I reported to who was Senior VP of Human Resources. When the merger came up, it was my thought whether or not I would be transitioning out of JFK because my life situation had changed, and so I was ready to take on more responsibility. And I thought I'd stay and see what the merger had to offer. And this is where I want to highlight the importance of having a sponsor in your career and in your life. So when and especially when that you have an executive sponsor, that person is able to help you have a platform to gain visibility, and that person is able to help provide you with a network and advocate for you. And that's very different from a mentoring role. And so through her sponsorship and her opportunities to allow me to have visibility, I was able to transition back into a D&I role. And Wayne Boatwright was looking for a director. And hey, I interviewed with him, and I found myself back officially in D&I.
May I add one note on the sponsorship?
Yes.
I love that piece, and I talk about it all the time, especially with the diverse attorneys and the women attorneys at my firm, because again, looking at the demographics of the practice of law, you may not see a reflection of yourself. I underscore the importance of getting a sponsor or developing that relationship, but that the sponsor does not have to look like you. Mm-hmm. And I would not be in my position if it were not for a white man who recognized my talent, who wanted to mentor me, who wanted to actually develop my talent, and then, of course, wanted to elevate me to a position like Chief Diversity Officer. And so it may not always be the case that you find another woman or another person of color or another person, who looks like you, talks like you, et cetera. It is totally okay. And I also encourage then the white men. Right. Make sure that you open yourself up to developing a relationship and developing that pipeline of talent for people who do not look like you or do not come from where you come from.
So my journey was a little unique because I started out my career after college as a stockbroker. So I was selling particularly mutual funds, retirement accounts, and I was in a headquarters in Philadelphia. And they decided to open up an office in North Carolina and asked if I would relocate. So diversity became my other duties as assigned, that at the bottom of our job description. Right. So I was the liaison for the North Carolina office, and that's my opportunity to get my foot wet in this kind of work. Long story short, I moved back to Philadelphia. And then I was working for Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, where I found somebody similar to what you said, mm-hmm. who not only mentored me, but sponsored me and spoke for and about me when I wasn't in the room. Mm-hmm. And it really elevated me and my career on a fast track to a Chief Diversity Officer. So similar to what everybody said here, find those key people that not only believe in you, but believe in the work. And it absolutely, I'm a proponent of that kind of mentorship and specifically the sponsorship piece, to not only advocate for you, but your career when you're not in the room.
Great points. I was 20 years into my experience of work before I met and had a female sponsor that looked just like me. Mm-hmm. And so, again, being open to those spaces and realizing that sponsor is in the room when you're not and speaking for you. And so as we go on with more questions, some people say that diversity and inclusion is that cool, sexy, trendy thing that's happening now. How do you define it?
Well, if you like money, then yes, it's cool, sexy. Because I think the key that I think we all have to do is regardless of where you sit in any organization, our job is to make other people connect to the work we do. Most of our offices, as you heard, some of us is just a team of one, maybe 3 or 4 at the most. So our job is to really make sure that you understand whether you're in procurement, finance, marketing, sales, you understand your role and how it connects to us. And it's always a return on investment. No matter who I'm talking to, I understand their language. So it's almost like we have to be a jack of all trades because we really have to understand the language of the people we're speaking to. When I have a diversity conversation with the senior VP of HR, it's much different than the conversation I have with our vice president or our CFO. Mm-hmm. So you have to understand where they're coming from. everybody doesn't always understand their role in diversity and inclusion, but they can always understand what's the business that I have in diversity and inclusion. So if you tell the senior vice president of HR, I can help you fill that role a week shorter than what you're currently doing, there's a return on investment in that. That job is being filled quicker. It's not pending as long. You don't have people working overtime. There's a bottom line that you can equate to diversity and inclusion. So I think part of our goal is to help our champions and our colleagues understand that.
I was going to add something. So it's really good for business, right? I mean, to have a diverse population is good for business. And what businesses are finding out is that the disability population, other underserved populations, have huge buying power. And the people related to them and their interests are a great source of marketing for companies, and companies are starting to target these diverse populations. And what better way to understand what diverse populations need than by having a workforce that's diverse? There's Frances West, who was the Chief Diversity Officer and Accommodation Officer at IBM, recently published a book called Authentic Inclusion. And her definition of diversity is to look and embrace differences in your populations. I mean, that's what diversity is that businesses can do well looking at everybody's differences, and that really creates that innovation, the disruptive innovation that some people call, to move forward and push that business, because it's a confluence of factors. You have the principles, you have the purpose, and you have profit all aligned together, and it shows a business how invested they are in their people to help move a business forward.
Yeah, my co-panelists have spoken a lot, and I totally agree about the business case for diversity. And I think that's a wonderful starting point, especially if you're just trying to get your colleagues to understand the importance for diversity. But, I believe that diversity is really just a numbers game, whereas inclusion is your end game. That's where you're trying to go. Diversity, of course, is making sure that you have a bunch of different people in the room, different ideas. They look different, they come from different places. But how do we make them feel like they are valued and that they really matter to the organization? And so that's when it comes down to, well, what kind of work are we giving them? Are we also promoting them? Are we letting them take the lead on this presentation? Are we giving them any client-facing roles? That's really where you want to get to. So it's wonderful to get, if that's what it takes for you to open the door, is to get that business case out there. Sure, it is wonderful for business. Yes, we can make a lot more money. The company looks better if we have diversity. But when we get to inclusion, that's when we can really make this a better environment for really all of our attorneys.
Great point. As you look around the room, you can see that diversity actually happens organically, right? When we enter the room, it happens that way. But to be intentional about inclusion is where the rubber meets the road. And so what you permit is what you promote. And so how do you go about changing the dial on our favorite station, WIFM, what's in it for me, and secure broad support for our D&I initiatives at various levels?
I feel like I'm talking a lot. Please.
Well, I think it's critical that you have buy-in from your top leadership. It's also critical that you have buy-in even at the lowest levels of the organization. So it has to be top down and bottom up. It has to be both. I don't think that it can really be effective one without the other. So I feel like once you have that, if your case is that you start out where you have it where you have the buy-in at the top level, then I think it's a point of putting together that very intentional and strategic plan that is multifaceted, that it includes everyone, or opportunities for everyone throughout the organization, all your functional areas, all your levels within the organization. So you have different committees. Your board is invested. Your top leadership is invested. You have team member resource groups where you can have employees at any level within the organization invested. You offer talent development opportunities. You change your recruitment practices. You're looking at your retention. You empower people. Very importantly, not just people serving in roles, but people being empowered in those roles to make a difference. You can have a chief diversity officer, and that person could still not be empowered to promote inclusion. It could still be just very much about diversity. So I think it's very, it's many layers to it.
In 2017, Kessler Foundation with the University of New Hampshire sponsored a survey of supervisors of people with disabilities. So we looked at a business-to-business panel of 6,500 supervisors across the country. And to Avonia's point, what they showed is that the buy-in of supervisors and managers were coming from the impression they got from top down. So it was not just that, but then it's up to, okay, we've decided to do this, but then what's the culture change? How are we doing this within the company? What's the inclusion? But it all really is coming from the C-suite directive. And we also found that it comes with people with clout and numbers. So it's one thing for a manager to say, I want to have a diverse team, but if there's not money and budget behind it to really help that get some credibility in the organization, it's just not going to happen.
Absolutely. So as we talk about commitment and top down and leaning in, I am so proud to be a part of the RWJ Barnabas Health System, where we are committed to great support, where we have over 85% of our 33,000 employees that were trained in sensitivity training, right? Where we have 8 directors across our state in the Office of Diversity, Inclusion, and Facilities, where we have had 8 facilities that were named leaders in health equality by the Human Rights Campaign. And so it feels really good to be a part of that. Talk to me about meaningful successes that you've had in the diversity, as a diversity inclusion leader at your organization.
Again, I believe the pipeline programs, and so getting that talent in the door early so that we can be able to develop that talent is critical, particularly for a law firm. And so I took over the summer associate program really because I wanted to make sure that we were very intentional about the composition of that summer associate class, and then about the opportunities that we afforded them when they were an intern and then also when they joined the firm. And so we do that through a number of partnerships. We expose our interns to our clients. And so we show them these are the opportunities you will be afforded if you join our firm. We're not going to have you, locked in some back room somewhere reviewing some documents and never seeing the light of day. No, you will actually get out there. You will actually go and appear before judges. You will actually go and meet our clients. And it's been wildly successful. Since 2017, 72% of our people coming in the door have been of color, and 65% of them have been women through our summer associate program. So wildly successful, I think primarily because we have shown those individuals from the very beginning of their careers that we are serious about diversity and inclusion.
And similar to what you just announced, all 6 of our hospitals received the HEI designation just recently. So excited about that. But more importantly, to Lloyd's point, I'm really excited about what we're doing for the younger people coming into healthcare, and also exposing people to healthcare who don't think that their field of interest lives in a healthcare organization. So for instance, somebody interested in marketing may think that they have to go to New York and become part of a big firm, but they don't understand that in most of our organizations, we have a marketing team. So we're excited about bringing young people in early. So our one of the models we're looking at is expose early, engage often. So the earlier we can get you in, regardless of age or grade, get you into experiencing what is in healthcare, because we all know there's a million things other than a nurse and a doctor. Not to, tell anybody they can't be that, but we really want to get people in the pipeline, exposing them. And to Lloyd's point, we're doing more than you filing papers, making copies. You're in the trenches. You're visiting the ORs. You're on the going to different marketing events. So we have you doing meaningful work. So we're excited about in broadening our intern program. I'm sorry, there's something flying up here. I know. I'm gonna look crazy on the video. But we're just excited about what we're doing in the intern world.
Okay, so I heard someone say that leaders in diversities are like air traffic controllers, right? That we work in synergy to make sure that we are creating an environment that is inclusive, that we're moving away from that singular lens, right? Mm-hmm. That we look at airplanes and imagine them coming in with that singular lens, and we offer and create a space that opens the opportunity for diverse lenses. So what are some of the unique challenges that you may have had in leading some of the diversity initiatives in your organization and getting that buy-in? We orchestrate.
I'm going to say, well, I don't think that this is a unique challenge.
Okay.
But I think it's the challenge that has to be addressed when you think about privilege. And when you talk about diversity and inclusion, we have to give thought and consideration to privilege, because there is a group, preferably white males, that have a great deal of privilege. And in order to advance the work of D&I, it's the what's in it for me, and thinking of that from the perspective of the white male. And so how do you move your initiatives being inclusive of the white males and offering them an opportunity and a safe place to deal with their authentic self and the discomforts that they may have when they may be thinking about, what does this mean for me, and am I losing power, and all of the privilege that comes with it, privilege that you could be conscious or unconscious about. So I think that that's a barrier that we all have to contend with. And so how do we do that? In unconscious bias training, we hear a lot about that. That's a very trendy thing today in the D&I space. The training alone, I don't believe, is enough to truly deal with that. And so how do we go a step further to have an opportunity for them to deal with it in a safe place? Maybe it's executive level coaching. Maybe it has to be some kind of ongoing kind of continuum that addresses that effectively.
I agree. I think training is sometimes people throw that as the fix of all things. And unconscious bias training, although is really, really good, let's talk about the conscious things that's happening in our organization. There's some conscious and deliberate decisions being made as to why not do diversity and inclusion. So let's address those, because those are the barriers that's really, challenging us with really doing the work that we want to do. So while unconscious bias training, I think, is a really good tool, it's not the only tool. And we have to be very intentional about when we're going to talk about diversity and inclusion, and when sometimes it's not a diversity conversation. We need to address the challenge, and maybe that challenge is somebody or some system, but I think we have to be very intentional about the conversation.
I would also agree. So in our work with Pepsi America's Beverage and Lowe's and Office Max Depot, and in all the other companies that currently have large initiatives to hire people with disabilities, it's been an executive champion or a senior champion working with an executive sponsor who's really pushed these initiatives in the company, because there is that unconscious bias, as mentioned. There's discomfort and challenge to hire people that may look and act differently than you, especially when you're dealing with a disability, who may have some soft skills issues. We were talking before about eye contact. How do you interview somebody who has a disability? Maybe a little bit different. To onboard them, to support and training, get them involved in your culture is very different. But what we've also found in our study that I referenced before is that companies like Walgreens and Amazon and Sephora, they've all worked with local providers to help them. So if you're a company who wants to do these initiatives, and maybe there isn't anybody, even on your D&I team, who are used to working with people with disabilities, which is a whole nother culture and ballgame, they've brought in local providers, and 91% of the companies that did that found it very effective. So we're seeing that more and more space is that some of the companies now are recognizing that they need talent in the community to help them work with their team when they look at onboarding, recruiting, and training.
I also must add that, again, not a unique challenge at all, but from the Chief Diversity Officer viewpoint, making sure that everyone in your organization gets comfortable with being uncomfortable. And having that conversation, and the conversations about race, and having conversations about gender, having conversations about inequities, it's okay to have that conversation. You must have that conversation. And I say conversation without an S on it, but it's one you have to have that's ongoing. The Chief Diversity Officer cannot get up at the annual meeting to report out on all of those different numbers and metrics and how we're doing. The Chief Diversity Officer needs to make sure they're on the agenda at every single meeting, every single time that the leadership of the organization gets together. Just as important as everything else on that agenda is diversity. And also, again, talking about empowering people, making sure that that CDO is empowered to be able to be in the room when those decisions are made. So getting people comfortable with there being an extra seat pulled up to the table, where before we make that decision about who we're going to promote, have we considered diversity? Have we considered what our C-suite looks like? Have we considered what every committee chair in the organization, what they look like? Have we considered the other people who might be wonderful or fantastic in those roles? Again, getting them way more comfortable with a new way of doing things, a new way of thinking, and making sure that we are being inclusive and considering more people in our talent pool.
Yeah, moving from that space of where we think that cultural sensitivity training is a one and done, right?
Absolutely.
And cultural competency is a continuum. We're never there. We're never going to get there. But how do we work in that space of cultural humility, where we talk about the levels of respect and how we engage in that space? Have different spaces where we're looking at implicit bias, right? We're looking at how we recruit our new talent, and then succession planning as well. And so you talked about, Vanya, the mergers
Yes, I did.
and corporate responsibility. And so speak a little bit more on that, because I think during the phone conversation that we had earlier, it was more about how do we make sure that we're sustaining and maintaining and touching the different spaces as we grow larger, right?
Yes, so I think that this is a critical topic, especially in the healthcare industry, where the trend is mergers right now. So as we talk about D&I think about the fact that Hackensack Meridian now, the Diversity and Inclusion Department, is now a corporate level department, network-wide responsibility. Hackensack Meridian Health is the largest healthcare provider in New Jersey, still growing. So as we continue to look at additional mergers, where does D&I fit in with that? My perspective, D&I needs to have a seat at the table from the beginning, because it should be very intentional part of the merger, just as the integration of IT, just as the integration of human resources. Your most valuable resources in your organization it's your team members. So we need to be very intentional and very strategic about how we are merging and bringing those organizations together, diversity at every level. And it's not diversity from the standpoint of counting numbers, but making diversity itself count on the bottom line impact of the organization. So what are the best practices? I don't have the experience to speak to that, and I think I haven't seen much on it, so I think it's a new topic. But I think as diversity and inclusion professionals that we need to raise the platform for this, that it needs to get more attention, and we should have a template of best practices of how to go forth for the best outcomes with a merger from the perspective of diversity and inclusion.
Building on that, I think that there's a ton of due diligence that's done when you're going to effectuate a merger. And if the finances aren't right, then you can't go forward with the merger. And if we don't have the right leadership that's going to be in place, we can't go forward with the merger. If we don't have a culture that is going to embrace diversity and inclusion as one of our core values of this organization or the new merged organization, then maybe we can't go forward. Or it's going to take a lot more of us sitting down and talking and having a talk about this, talking about what our culture is and how intentional we are about our diversity efforts, and how I need you to get on board before we make this merger final. Because again, what you don't want to do is you don't want to effectuate that merger and then lose all the momentum that you've been gaining in your prior organization by way of making people feel included and creating a more diverse workforce. And then you have this merger and all that kind of dissipates because you have these new people who come on board. So you want to make sure that, again, when you're doing all that due diligence, when you have the prospectus, there's a section in there that talks about diversity. And what are our new leadership, our new merged leadership, what is the composition of that leadership? What does it look like? It is great. Again, I'm a proponent of the pipeline programs and making sure that your entry-level workforce is diverse and that they feel included. But that diversity in the leadership is super critical. Again, because if you talk about why are people going to stay in your organization, they're going to stay because they feel like they have a future. They feel like they have a future. If they look up at that head table when you're having your annual meeting and there are a bunch of different faces, a bunch of different perspectives, and people who may look like them.
And most of us, or one way to measure inclusion is the equivalence of engagement.
Mm-hmm.
So when you are going through a merger or acquisition, and that culture piece is not taken into account, because when we all think about it, that other organization has their own mission, vision, values, etc. How well does that align with the other organization? And when that diminishes, there goes your engagement. Thus, there goes your inclusion. Thus, there goes your productivity. So there's a reason for us to be at the table when you're going through mergers and acquisitions.
I like what you all said about being at the table from the beginning, right? So it's not an afterthought. It's not the after dinner mint. It's the main course, right?
That's right.
And so tell me about a time where you definitely had to stand up to a more challenging situation to make sure that diversity and inclusion was at the table, or maybe when you were brought in after the fact, how did you handle situations of moving forward initiatives and things?
So I'll give an example of a previous organization. We talk about wanting to diversify, and we want to do things different from a recruiting standpoint. However, most organizations use a archaic, and I say that with all respect, but use an archaic recruiting system or recruiting tool. So we all have a system probably that screens resumes for keywords. And then, so we don't even see the people unless those resumes get through the system. So what happens if, I'm an entrepreneur and those keywords aren't in my resume, but I just created a viral video. I have a marketing background and I create a viral video and have amazing skills. But because my resume doesn't have those things, I'll never get through to your organization, to your HR team. And that's the challenge we face with wanting to diversify the staff, but wanting to use older platforms and older systems. How many times have we been in a restaurant and saw somebody that delivered amazing service? And do we ever talk to that person about their career or about their interest in customer service focused areas? We tell them to go online to apply. But are they really getting through to us? So I think we have to do some due diligence around how we recruit and then the platforms that we're using to recruit. Because as we all know, it's changing quite a bit. So we just need to be able to make sure that the conversation matches the systems and protocols that's in our organizations.
And adding to that, especially when it comes to individuals with disabilities, the algorithms, if you're on a kiosk, time out. They don't necessarily give enough time for somebody who has some learning differences to complete those applications. That is a huge, huge barrier. The same thing with some of the word choices. So when we worked with Pepsi America's Beverage in that project, they had they branded the whole campaign Achieving Change Together. And they ended up creating some different kiosks. And the jobs would open up the kiosks the same time as others, but they knew if it came in through a certain kiosk, it was highly probable, but not necessarily for legal reasons, a definition of disability. So somebody with learning differences were encouraged to go through certain kiosks. At the same time, the jobs opened, and they probably knew if it came in through that portal, it was tagged as a disability. And it made a huge difference because it allowed people to get through some of the systems. Some of the corporation with the interviewing, we've talked about getting people in the door, but then what happens? What is your interviewing process? How are you, to talk about white privilege and some other issues, how are you training people to interview? Is your interview itself accessible to people with disabilities? If somebody needs an interpreter, if somebody needs some sign language, is that available up front? Does somebody ask over the phone, is there any special things you need during your interview to make it a more probable interview so that you are getting the best out of the person? Because after all, we all want everybody to come in and do their best and show the best foot to the company, and that always doesn't happen when you're looking at especially disability populations.
Talking about a situation where I had to insert myself. When I put together my job description for the role of Chief Diversity Officer, it included having a seat on the Personnel Committee. And one of the first things we did as a Personnel Committee when I joined was to take a renewed look at our company policies. Really, now that we have someone who is specifically focused on diversity, let's make sure we look at all these policies through that lens of how inclusive are they, and do they have an eye toward making this a wow, the NAT is crazy. Are our policies as inclusive as possible? And so one that comes to the top of mind is parental leave. I know that historically, if you are a woman and you end up becoming an attorney and you start to get to this crossroads where, okay, do I want to have children, or do I want to have a family, or do I want to become a partner one day? Those two roads do not diverge. I mean, you can be a woman and you can be a partner. You can be in senior leadership in a law firm. And so let's make sure that our policies reflect that. And also, it's parental leave and it's not just maternity leave. There are men who want to make sure that they are also there for their children. There are men who are in same-sex relationships who end up adopting children or having surrogates. And so we want to give them time off. And so you want to make sure that you're building these policies and getting a chance to look at them from the, we're in the ever-evolving time where there are new pronouns that come out. We need to make sure that all of our pronouns do not say him and he and every single thing that we have in our policies, but that they are a bit more unisex, or that they're a bit more fluid. Again, all of that is just something that you could do as Chief Diversity Officer to come in, give a new set of eyes to all of those policies, and to make sure that your organization is forward-thinking.
Well, I will weigh on on this, and not from a personal perspective, but you were saying when you've had D&I has had to insert itself as an aftermath. So in the case of Hackensack Meridian Health, which has been merging over the past more than 3 years, as I mentioned earlier, the Diversity and Inclusion Office was out of the Meridian hospitals. So now that we are a corporate network department, is an aftermath response. But I want to commend the leadership at Hackensack Meridian Health for recognizing that D&I needs to be a network-wide initiative and needs to be a part of the strategic initiative, and for also empowering our Vice President of Human Resources, Mr. Wayne Boatwright, to lead our team in a manner to really move forward the D&I agenda for our patient side as well as our team member side.
So as we look across the spaces of diversity and inclusion, and we mentioned special abilities and disabilities, gender, I don't think we touched on generational too much, right? Mm-hmm. And there's a big gap there. I talked about my 4 children, right? Every other day it's trying to understand what they're saying in text message, right? And so how we communicate across the board. IDK, TTUIL, IKR, right? Don't use the emoji with the heart eyes, mommy. Why not? I don't want to know. But how are we looking at our policies? And I think we touched upon that a little bit. How are we looking at our policies and making sure, are you on the front end of changing policies, on the back end, or part of a committee that now looks at these policies that we're more inclusive as an organization?
It is embracing technology, understanding that it may be an old way of looking at things to think that everyone has to be in the office every single day for X number of hours per day, and that people can do work from home, particularly if there is a family need or if there are other personal circumstances that do not permit an individual to be able to come in the office every day. They can still contribute to your organization even if they are away or working remotely. So I think embracing technology is a big one for the generational shift there. But also, I wanted to make sure that we are thinking about how younger individuals, millennials, and I don't say that in any kind of a derogatory way, no longer want to just stay in one organization for their entire career. We have a number of people, and I think it speaks, very highly of our law firm, who have been at Archer for 20, 30 years. They've been practicing law at the exact same place. And you begin to think that everyone you recruit in is also going to have that same trajectory. Well, that's not true. A lot of millennials think, okay, I'll go here and I'll go ahead and get a couple years experience, and then I'll take that and I'll translate it over here, and then I'll just completely stop practicing law for a little while and I'll go start my own thing over here. That's okay. It is okay, and it does not reflect negatively on your organization that you have someone who comes, contributes in a meaningful way, and then takes their talent elsewhere. I mean, in the best world, they take their talent somewhere where they can then work with you. in a different kind of way, and then bring some kind of business back to the law firm or to whatever your organization is. So again, just beginning to think about those things from a different lens, and that means also including them. Now that makes me sound like I'm not young at all. Including us, including people of different ages, when you're making those policies, because it's very hard. I think there was a statistic earlier about baby boomers versus millennials. It's very hard for baby boomers to make policies about millennials when they're not sitting in the room together and talking about what are the needs and what are the challenges for their respective groups. So making sure that everyone is there from an age perspective as well.
I also think that it's important to think about what motivates the different generations, because our motivations are different from generation to generation, and not to classically stereotype, because there are people who may fall across different, multiple generations when you start looking at the overview specific for each individual generation. I think that it is one thing that it is a best practice is having a generational employee resource group. At Hackensack Meridian Health, we have a young professionals team member resource group. In other organizations, they have generational ERGs where it's open to everyone, and it's an opportunity for various generations to come together and to work together. And I think that provides a great vehicle for people to learn each other from across the different generations and to begin to build those bridges and those type of relationships that are necessary.
And so when I was with a previous organization, I did a study, and I surveyed about 200 millennials that left our organization in the last 2 years, and to see why. And I think it was important data for us, because we understood that it wasn't opportunity and advancement is different sometimes for different, it's different for everybody. But their definition of opportunity and advancement wasn't always a promotion. It was, am I giving more projects? Am I given meaningful projects or visible projects? And a lot of them wrote responses instead of just, check yes, no, but they wrote meaningful responses as to why they left. And a lot of it was because of lack of opportunity. And so I think it's up to us and all of us here to make sure that when we are engaging with people, to Avania's point, we're giving them opportunities and that motivate them. So not just something we need to get done and get off our plate, but really thinking about, we used to call it go-to people. Do I always go to Lloyd because I know Lloyd can get the project done? Or do I go to Elaine because I know Elaine wants to work on this, but she hasn't been given an opportunity yet? Mm-hmm. And I think that's sometimes where you find your rising stars.
And I just want to add, how about everybody staying in the workplace longer? So now we have people who've been in the same organization for many, many years, interacting with individuals who've just been there a few years and are put on the same project teams or the same, interactions within the office. And we have a lot, even in our own office, we have a lot of young adults who are there between 25 and 40, and the baby boomers are saying, why does somebody just leave one thing left in a box, or why is there an empty box? And it's like being sometimes with your own family members at home. So that whole workplace culture, the shift between the generations is very, very different and can create some tensions, frankly.
And just one other thing, when we put all these conversations together, we talk about mentorship and sponsorship, generations. There's a unique opportunity to re-engage, particularly around the nursing population. Nurses that may be looking to retire or have retired, and bringing them back on a part-time basis to help mentor some of our younger nursing students. So there's a really great collaboration there that can happen for people that may want to come back for a few hours to help, mentor and sponsor some of our younger, particularly around our patient care and nursing population.
I'm so sorry, but Armand resonated with me with that go-to person, and how you actually give out your work and who you are constantly working with. Don't forget about the inverse of that. Every time that your go-to person is Lloyd, the person that you are excluding is Elaine. And so making people just realize that. Yes, maybe Lloyd does fantastic work, But but that doesn't mean that Elaine does not do fantastic work. And so just opening someone's eyes to that, that you need to, be intentional about diversifying the people that you are working with. That's super critical. And if they can't get it there, then tie it to their compensation. Ask them every year in their review, who are you working with? That list should not look the same from year to year, because that's a very homogenous team that you're putting together, and you're not opening yourself up to making sure that our workforce is inclusive, of being able to have that opportunity to go with you on that pitch meeting or to work with you on a huge project. Make sure that that is a question that is asked every single year right before we talk about compensation. And again, you can start to do that, and you can start to chip away at some of the old culture. And when you can do it for long enough, then people will, of course, start to say, oh, wow, I got to make sure that I start working with some new people because, it's going to be tied to my compensation. I don't care how you get there, but let's start working with some new people. Let's start including Elaine.
I think it's key that you mention generational gaps and bridging that, and also looking at the spaces where we're looking at the millennials coming in. As I look at myself, being 25 years employed in the same organization, having diverse roles in the organization, but having the ability to work with our intern like Kelly that's sitting over there, who gives us a different lens of the new innovative ideas and approaches, not being caught in that box. I love what you said, Armand, about taking the risk of interviewing differently, right? And so as we close up with some final thoughts, I know Vanya said that she's looking to learn about best practices, but what would you give as key best practices about developing a D&I practice in institutions?
Well, by learning about best practices for mergers.
Okay.
It would be a key focus of mine, and I would. You're asking me what would I recommend for it?
Yeah.
So my number one recommendation is that a D&I is at the table from the beginning when you start the conversation about mergers and acquisitions. They're there from the beginning, and they're there throughout the entire, and they're there after the merger and acquisition. That it is a strategic component of the actual merger acquisition document and plan, and that it's looked at from every angle and integrated in.
So I would ditto everything that was said. Also to think of it from a strategic standpoint. So, what's going to be the pros and cons of this merger and acquisition? And of course, we have our finance people that are looking at the finances and all that, but I think from a people standpoint, we have to look at it as well. So everything that Vanya said, I think we need to be at the table from the beginning to the end, and just make sure our voices are heard and that we're listening to the organization as well. So if we have the pulse of the organization and we know the direction, and if you've always had a strategic plan around diversity and inclusion and you know what those pillars and stresses are, then I think understanding the organization that's part of that merger and acquisition will help push that along a little further.
I would say that one of the challenges is to encourage companies to include disability as part of their diversity definitions and as a population. It's not just to the side, it's really part of everything else that everybody up here is trying to accomplish in D&I.
Best practices for diversity and inclusion, I think, are giving all of your employees access to senior leadership. Making sure that every single person, even if they are not reflected in the senior leadership, that they have access to them, that they feel like their voice can be heard, that their opinions matter, and that they really have a future at the organization. They must be able to have some kind of access. Maybe it's via the chief diversity officer, but they have to have some kind of access to senior leadership in the organization.
All right, and I'm gonna, before we go into Q&A, I'm just gonna say the one thing I think about best practice at RWJ Barnabas Health is that we have our chief diversity officer sitting at the corporate level, making sure and ensuring that at each facility that there is an Office of Diversity and Inclusion, that there are 8 directors that are now leading the charge and making sure that everything that we talked about here is across our system, and that there is equity across internally and externally. And so at this time, I'd like to open up for questions and answers.
Thank you. Fabienne Jacquet, Innovive, Unleashing Feminine Skills to Disrupt Innovation. And there is diversity you cannot see, but you can hear now from my New Jersey accent. I wanted to come back to the age discussion, because I don't know if it happened in your career, but you are too young for this job. And before you know, you are too old. So is there a perfect age for a job? So question for the panel, how do you deal with no putting any age tag on a specific job? And the second is about mentoring, because we have a tendency to say, older people, we will mentor the younger. What about reverse mentoring? Because I think as, baby boomers, we have a lot to learn from the young generation. Thank you.
Well, I would like to speak to the mentoring, and I am a big fan of reverse mentoring. I think that we all have to, if we want to be successful in this economy in the 21st century, we have to be lifelong learners. And so that means that we can never stop learning. And so even as the baby boomer, you're still learning. And again, as you said, the millennials, the Gen Zers, they bring new perspectives and new different knowledge and skill set that as baby boomers we don't, or Gen Xers, we don't have. So just as we have the ability to impart and share knowledge, they have that ability to do the same for us. And I think that creates a great synergy and is a best practice of cross-cultural mentoring. So I feel that every D&I plan should have a component for cross-cultural mentoring.
Yeah, there are a lot of law students who end up going to law school as a second career in life. And so there are scores of people who end up graduating and they're already in their 30s or in their 40s. And I think that it certainly helps you in your organization to be able to match those individuals up with some of the younger people in the organization. And so, again, getting them comfortable with being uncomfortable. Why don't you go ahead and give that new 40-year-old attorney a 31-year-old mentor? That's someone who's gotten the chance to be at the organization for a few years already. I can still show you the ropes as to how this organization works and, who you should speak with or what's it like working with that guy over there. Whereas you're able to give me some of that return mentoring and talk about your background and your experience in your previous career. So I think that it certainly can work out, but it may not be one of those natural relationships that forms. So be intentional about it. Just put them together at the table and then just watch it work. Watch it work.
I also want to say the importance of having interns and those fresh eyes. So talking about that singular lens, when you have someone that's not embedded in the culture of your organization, now be able to come and join in the organization, adds a new set of lenses to, a new ideas to what's going on and how to work in that space. Again, working with those who are in school or just coming out of school, the technology is crazy, right? I've worked with an intern. Every time I asked her for something, she said, "There's an app for that. There's an app for that." So I'm Team Android, not Team I, and so just learning to be able to be flexible in that space and understand that technology grows, and they're growing up coloring outside the lines. We grew up in the box, right? Drawing out. So be open to engaging students as well.
Hi, I'm Audrey Palanitza. Thank you all for being here today. Your insights are really, really great. I guess maybe a little hand in hand with the reverse mentoring, but back to kind of the sponsorship. How would you really identify a key sponsor? Should that be individual, self-driven? Should that be firm-driven? Would you say that it's difficult to find a true sponsor, a real advocate for kind of maybe somebody that wants to move up in their career or, take on new challenges?
please.
So as far as a sponsorship, I think that there's nothing wrong with you taking ownership of finding your own sponsor. A sponsor may pick you out. A sponsor, it just may organically happen, but you can also be very intentional. Your company might have an actual structured program where they assign executives as sponsors for certain people, but if they don't, there's certainly nothing wrong with you being very intentional in assessing your executives and approaching and just being very intentional and asking that question as to whether, letting them know that you're looking for a sponsor. Sometimes it can just evolve out of natural relationships. What's important about it is if your company does have a structured sponsorship program, is that a best practice is for the executive to have accountability for your growth and development. So in a case like that, they will probably identify, 2 or 3 areas to work on as far as your level of development. And they have that accountability to make sure that results are achieved. So year over year, it would not be acceptable for your executive sponsor to say, well, yeah, they're still working on it or it didn't happen, because it is the executive's accountability to provide in those opportunities to make sure that you grow in those developmental areas. So I think this is just being very intentional about it and knowing that the overall outcome of that is that you're going to be, you're developing those areas where you need to develop so that you're ready to land that if you're in middle management, possibly that next executive position, but you don't want to have a situation where every time the opportunity comes up, the person I'm sponsoring is not ready yet. She's not ready yet, because that accountability has to go back to the executive sponsor. And if you approach an executive and the person says to you that they're not able to do it, I don't think that you should be discouraged by that, because you should actually be thankful that they're being honest, because if they don't have the time to invest, you want to know that, and then just take advantage of the opportunity to ask them, well, is there someone that you can recommend?
And so your sponsor could very, very well come out of a mentor relationship. And I had one that did exactly that. So it could organically happen, but also to your point, be very intentional. So if you know that somebody has the skill set, the competencies, and maybe a similar path, then I would be intentional about that relationship. But it's also great to know up front, if they don't have the bandwidth, that's okay, because it'll set you up for failure at the end. It's okay to say, you don't have the bandwidth, but can we at least have lunch, once a quarter or something like that. So it could still be a very informal program, but you can still, get things out of it. But I think organically happening, and even if you have an organization that has a formal mentor program, because I'm matched with somebody doesn't mean I'm stuck with that person. So make sure your programs are flexible enough to say, I appreciate it, you have great experience, great perspective, but it's not a mentor-sponsorship relationship, and don't be afraid to ask for somebody else.
Armand is spot on about mentorship growing into sponsorship. A lot is put on the shoulders of a sponsor. It's kind of like the heavy is the head that wears the crown. Because that sponsor has to be the person who's willing to put their name on the line for you in some instances. They're pounding on the table for you to get that promotion, or they're standing on the table and saying that you have to get that raise. And so, yes, it is a little weird for you to just knock on someone's door and say, hey, Elaine, would you mind standing on the table for me? When it comes out? So that may not be the right approach. But it is okay for you to say, Elaine, I admire your career. I've looked at your trajectory. We seem to align very well in that regard. Would you mind mentoring me? People are very much so open to doing that. And then over time, once she believes in you, and once she understands that you actually have what it takes to be able to get to that next level or to get that promotion, she's willing to put her name on the line, pound on the table, stand on the table in whatever instance. So I think that identifying that mentor is critical. And maybe that person doesn't have the gravitas right then to be your sponsor, but natural progression, they'll grow into that role. Maybe they're not an executive yet. And then, hopefully they can become your sponsor in the future.
And if you really want to learn what to ask of a mentor, be a mentor. If you mentor somebody and you have that relationship, you understand the skill set that you're pouring into somebody and what is or is not being poured into you. So I think if you're have a mentor up and being a mentor to someone else really helps understand what you need out of that relationship.
I think one of the key points that Lloyd mentioned when we first started was the raise of the hand, right? So being willing to step into a space and engage in projects and do something that's a little bit out your comfort zone, be that disruptor, to get noticed by a leader or a sponsor in that space. Work on projects that are intimately involved, where they're intimately involved so they can understand and speak to your work. It almost comes naturally to say that Atiya should be at this table next because this is what I've observed, this is how she's been walking. So be willing to raise your hand and say, you know what, I think I want to try something new. Would you be able to lead me or direct me on how I can work on this project? Or we look at outcomes all the time. We didn't talk a lot about the data, but when you produce the data, this is where your work speaks for yourself. And people are willing to invest and move you into those spaces where you're not seated.
I would also like to add one thing is that personal coaching can be very helpful also. That if you haven't developed some skills and sometimes that can be sponsored by your own organization or it may be something you want to seek out on your own and not let on, that you're seeking help for something. But that can fill in some of the gaps. So if you have been in a review and you're hearing that there's certain skills you lack or you don't feel confident in a certain situation, using a personal coach can really boost your own confidence and boost your skill level.
While we're waiting, can I just add to what Atiya said about results? So I think that is critical, results. I think there's a big difference between talking about working hard, trying to do something, and the effort that you put forth. There's a value on the effort that you put in. There's also a value on the results. So if you're constantly putting in efforts and not achieving results, that's not going to look well. You got to put the effort in and you have to achieve results, and you have to be able to speak about the results that you have achieved. You have to be able to identify that and specify that yourself and not necessarily look for others to be able to look at you and say what you've achieved. You've got to be able to be your own advocate about that.
Great point.
Hello, I'm Nichelle Santos, Vice President of NJBIZ Insurance Services. And this question is more specifically towards Lloyd as a D&I officer and expert litigator. Can you just talk a little bit about risk management and firms or organizations who do not come forward with a D&I program, what the environment is like, the litigation environment is like with diversity and inclusion being so important now? What happens with organizations that are not compliant?
Yeah, if I'm interpreting your question correctly, it is, how vulnerable you are as an organization if you do not have a D&I plan in place. You are susceptible to all kinds of liability from an HR standpoint, from a labor and employment standpoint, and making sure that those policies are inclusive of everyone, having a strict maternity leave and not offering it for fathers as well, and not offering it to individuals who end up adopting, or having surrogates, et cetera. That's huge. That is huge. And so anyone who is in, from a risk management perspective, who comes and speaks to your organization will be able to totally agree with your diversity officers in saying that you need to make sure that your policies are very much so given a fresh set of eyes from a diversity lens, because again, you want to make sure that you're not opening yourself up to any kind of liability that could be damaging, not only, of course, from an external view because you end up in the court system, but what does that do to your culture when you then see people who have to turn around and bring suit against your organization, or just simply that your organization is susceptible to it? It's not a good look at all.
And to piggyback on that, if you're in healthcare, well, I'm sure you know this. If you're in healthcare and have not read the Affordable Care Act, please do. There is language in there that mandates for healthcare organizations to do some of the work that we're doing around language access specifically is a huge component of the Affordable Care Act. There's language in there around physicians getting cultural competency training. So, there's the it pretty much lifted Title VII up, dropped it in the Affordable Care Act, and expanded on what that is, particularly for patients. So I would highly recommend that you read Section 1557 of the Affordable Care Act.
See, there's the business case for diversity, there's a legal case for diversity, the moral case.
The right thing to do.
Good morning. Thank you so much for being here. I'm Pam Samarco, Green Training Associates. I am just curious about the trend on pay equity issues, what your companies are doing for pay equity on the gender parity basis, and the new law that was just signed by Sheila, the Lieutenant Governor. So it's a critical issue, and I'm wondering if your firm has suggestions about what you're doing for women in pay equity for men.
All of our positions in our organization are on a review cycle. So at all times, there's a group of jobs going through a review cycle to ensure there's no pay equity challenges. So that is happening 24/7, 365 days a year. We review positions. Right now, I think we're going through at least half of our nursing teams just to make sure there's no pay equity issues in that, around gender, around race, around geographic areas, et cetera. So we are constantly in a review cycle with job descriptions and job grades.
At Hackensack Meridian Health, I can't speak to exactly what is being done, but I do know that, and I've spoken with the vice president of over benefits and wellness, so I do know that it is something that is being addressed at the network level. I know that they have the compensation specialists who are doing reviews and studies, and I know that they are looking to align.
At our facilities, we have the beauty of having a director at our facilities that's working hand in hand on a strategic plan with our HR department. So we are part of the recruitment process and the interview panel to make sure that we're looking at how equitable things are being done in our organizations.
Thank you. So what is learning and development's role in all of this, right? So we have diversity and inclusion training, and it seems to last an hour, and it's often online, and it just really isn't enough for the behavioral change that we need within organizations that's sustainable over time. So I'd love to hear what you think L&D's role is in making sure the folks have the key critical skills that they need to have those crucial conversations around diversity and inclusion. Because you've all sort of touched on how important it is to be able to talk about this, but how do we make sure that L&D is doing what they need to do around that? I just would love your thoughts on that.
Great question, because I'm not, you probably heard from my earlier response, a proponent of just diversity training. I think it has to be embedded into whatever learning and organizational development is already doing. So if you're having a series of courses or executive coaching classes, whatever that is, how do we embed a diversity inclusion module in there? Because if it's important for me to have to be an executive and have a certain set of competencies, why is diversity and inclusion a standalone course? It needs to be included, and that goes, I think, through anything that we're trying to do, is embed what we're doing across the organization. It's not okay that you say something inappropriate and then you are sent to me for diversity training. That's not how we want to be viewed. You should handle the behavior things as you would any other facet of your company or corporate mission, values, et cetera. So I really think that's a great question, because I really think we need to embed diversity inclusion training into the curriculum that you're already delivering.
I think that goes across the board, as Armand talked about, where diversity and inclusion supports and touches every entity of our organization, right? And so we work collaboratively and as partners inside of our institution. So working with HR, working with the different departments to make sure that we're creating those inclusive spaces, that it's always continual.
And I would agree with what Armand said as well, that it has to be embedded. And so just some examples could be that, if you give roll out that unbiased training, that it's embedded in an ongoing way with something like maybe there's like ongoing review of case studies and discussions around that. Maybe it's coupled with the fact that your leaders are assigned to an individual coach that's an inclusion coach. Or maybe you have opportunities where you host maybe focus groups, and your employees have an opportunity to actually talk about the microaggressions that are happening and occurring within the organization, so that they can come out in the open and in a constructive way that it can be dealt with within the organization in a positive way. But it has to be an ongoing. It's not a one and done kind of thing. And also, I think that for example, if you do roll out that unconscious bias training or sensitivity training, how are you measuring the effectiveness of that as well? Are you tracking the complaints that are coming in so that you can actually see whether or not your trend is trending up or trending down, or being able to speak to the data of what the effect of that training is?
And another point is, what happens if you don't have a D&I officer in an organization? I mean, there are some very large systems here. What happens if you're 100 employees, 50 employees, 25 employees? Who is championing D&I within the organization? What's the culture of that organization? Again, when you're looking at disabilities and other diversities and you want to be inclusive, you're going to have to, some of that's going to have to bubble up from a champion in the organization to really work with people to understand, to make that change within the organization.
Making that culture shift in some organizations with the rollout of D&I policies, D&I initiatives, yes, it's going to involve some ongoing conversations. Yes, it's going to involve some training, and you have to give people a little bit of time for that learning curve. But don't make it an option. It is not an option. It's not an option for you to abide by any other policies in an organization, and so it is not an option as to whether you wish to abide by the D&I policies either. Zero tolerance for it. I mean, either you are going to be on this train and making sure that we promote an inclusive environment, or you are not.
And it also takes time. I mean, this is not going to happen overnight. It could take a period of years to permeate really the whole organization, to really become the DNA of the organization.
Mm-hmm.
We'll make sure it's still morning. Good morning, everyone. First, I must say, great job, phenomenal panel. Atiya, you always add value, an asset to our team. You are a subject matter expert, and it's a pleasure to work with you every day. One of the things that, to kind of just answer your question, is so I think that we all struggle with is really understanding diversity and inclusion is the vehicle, right? We're the influencer. We're not the advancer. We're not the driver. We're sometimes the disruptor. So for us, we don't own issues. So with RWJ Barnabas Health, when someone has a diversity issue and they say, well, that diversity and inclusion owns that. No, we don't. We all own this. And if you don't look at it that way, it becomes overwhelming and almost disheartening, because you won't feel like you're moving, because you do need time and you do need patience. And sometimes you're just being relentless. So for us, it's really getting everyone to understand this is your job. And when we talk about unconscious bias, sometimes we look at it as an individual issue, but you always have to look at it as a systemic issue, because there is systemic biases that exist that will always affect advancement. One of the things that we didn't talk a lot about today, but I think is important when you talk about diversity and inclusion, is social determinants of health, right? Anchor institutions. For us, we employ our communities. Our staff is very diverse. Our staff is actually more diverse than the state of New Jersey. So we know that when we talk about benefiting those employees, it has to be outside of the four walls. So for us, we made a commitment to increase our minimum wage to $15 this year. So as opposed to waiting for the 5 years like the state, we said we needed to make a full commitment. And this is a multi-million-dollar commitment. One of the things that Atiya, that you work with at Newark Beth Visual, is the greenhouse, right? If you could talk a little bit more about Hire Newark. We committed to hiring 350 residents of the city of Newark by 2020 as part of the mayor's 2020 initiative. So again, when you think about diversity, and we're always going to talk about pipelines and moving that up into our executive teams and mentoring, but you have to look at where is the commitment throughout the organization and building trust with everyone. When we go to our career ladder or graduations, you see that it's not only the individual that's being affected, but it's the entire family. And so what is your responsibility to those families?
That's I'm sorry.
Great point, Trina. I think we talked about the corporate citizenship, and I'm glad you brought up our greenhouse because it was that field of dreams, right? If you built it, they will come. And we built it right in the middle of the community, and the community didn't have access to it because at that time, we did not look at the affordability of it and the access to it, right? And so within our system, we looked at those social determinants and we looked at the access and rallied for governance to accept now across the state of New Jersey, so not just at our facility, but across the state of New Jersey, that we accept SNAP at the greenhouses, right? And so now it's open to the community. So it's not just at the community, but it's for the community and a part of the community, right? So we have to think about being intentional about our actions, not just doing things at people and doing programs because it's the cool, sexy thing to do, but what is the intent and what is the impact that comes out of it?
Mm-hmm. So kudos to you, because I think that's a great initiative when you talk about employing people from the community. So I challenge those of us that have supplier diversity programs that, you know, a lot of times we look at it from a vendor standpoint. But think about it when you're opening up, I'll use healthcare, opening up a new clinic or a new hospital. And of course you want to look at how many of those suppliers are diverse, what's your diverse spend, but also look at it from an employment perspective. How many people in zip code 0, I'm just making this up, 00123, if that's where your hospital is, how many people are you going to employ from that zip code? Because when you employ people from that zip code, the money 9 times out of 10 stays in that zip code versus hiring somebody from over the bridge and the money goes back over the bridge and not to that specific community. So when you think about supplier diversity and community relations and population health, think about those aspects. How can you really help build a community?
So hi, my name is Meridian Fabiano, and I'm with Move Forward Coaching and Consulting. So I do coaching, consulting in D&I space, and also in the recruiting space. So my question is around recruiting. So some of my fellow colleagues, one in particular, recently was asked to fill a specific position and was given specific skill sets, but it was also told that the person needed to be of an Indian background. And she sort of declined to work on that because she is of the mindset that, you know, I want to go for the best candidate out there, regardless of race, gender, and anything else. And the question comes up is, you know, how do I comply with EEOC requirements and recruit for diversity at the same time? So how would you answer that question?
I would say that we all want to hire the best candidate. And that when we're thinking from the standpoint that we want to hire a diverse workforce that reflects the communities that we serve, that we need to be intentional in those efforts as well. So what is your strategic recruitment plan for finding candidates, for locating candidates? So if you're just looking in one place and it's not yielding a diverse candidate pool, the diverse candidate pool, we don't have a lack of that. So what's your strategy? So maybe you need to address your strategy.
People sometimes don't know what they want. And so someone may tell you that they need an Indian candidate for a particular position, but you don't even have to be one particular race to be the Little Mermaid. So you can open someone's eyes to there being other candidates who are very much so qualified for a position, who are every single color under the rainbow. So I would absolutely push back on that and sometimes give people what they actually really do need and not necessarily what they're telling you that they want.
I think the opportunity there is to be able to pull from a diverse population, to have the access to interview a diverse population. So not necessarily a singular population, but that there's a diverse pool of equally talented people that we get to now choose from. Mm-hmm. We have time for one more question. Anyone?
So I'm not sure if I need the mic.
I think you're okay.
Good morning. I'm Wayne Boatwright, Vice President of Diversity for Hackensack Meridian. First of all, Atiya, I just wanted to really compliment the work that you did up there. I didn't want to leave without saying that. And also for the panel. I've been in this work for 20 plus years. And I will tell you that I am so encouraged of the leadership that is now beginning to do this work. You guys are addressing areas that for a long time we really did not address going forward. So for an example, one of the things, I think It's just incredible. And one of the things that I thought was most interesting is just the spin around inclusion. When I got started, it was really a focus around diversity. People talked and bragged a lot about the amount of people of color they had, the amount of members of the LGBTQ. They talked about all those other areas of diversity. But when they ended up reporting people in key positions and on governance and in decision-making positions, they were not there. So it took a long time for people to understand that was not inclusion. That was the illusion of inclusion, is what it really boiled down to. So I was so encouraged to kind of hear, and specifically, Elaine, I thought you just did a wonderful job around the area of disabilities and et cetera. We took a ton of notes as it relates to that because, again, I think a lot of times that those are not areas that are being addressed. And the only other point I will make is that I thought your point around leadership and from the bottom down is critical. Just keep in mind, leadership can mandate, compliance and making sure that you adhere to quite a bit, but they cannot mandate engagement, right? So it's important that from the leadership down, you may have that level of compliance and participating, but you still need the rest of your team to be engaged to create what I think one of you really talked about was if you don't have engagement, you don't have D&I. But I just didn't want to leave without offering my congratulations. Just absolutely tremendous and very heartfelt. Thank you very much.
So if there are any final panelist statements that you would like to say at this time, I engage you now, Avonia.
Well, I think I've said just about all that I came here to say today and probably then some more. But I do want to say thank you so much for the opportunity. I'm honored to serve on this panel and also with fellow panelists. I've learned so much from all of you, so thank you for all your contributions. Thank you again. And Atiya, you added a great deal of value as the moderator of the session as well. So I thank you as well.
Ditto everything that was said. As I stated up front in my opening remarks, that I was excited to be able to listen and learn as I was part of the panel.
No, you said steal. You went to steal.
That as well. I have quite a few notes. Again, Atiya, great job. But I think in this space that we're in the work that we're doing, I think it was said earlier that it's a journey. So anybody that's in this space, you do have frustrating days. I think it was said earlier, there are some days where you just can't take on another complaint, another anything. But I think understanding that it's for a greater good and a greater cause and if you have that mindset, you'll get through it. But, keep marching.
Thank you again. I really appreciate being part of this panel and giving a voice to disability, which is not always in the D&I space. And I do want to encourage you that, there is a diversity supplier program that's certified by a group called Disability In. They used to be the United States Business Leadership Network. For those of you who are looking for diversity into supplier networks, there are staffing networks that also specialize, as well as local providers, in individuals with disabilities seeking employment. So I'm happy to chat with anybody afterwards for any guidance. There are lots of consultants in the area too if you want to get a program going. But I really appreciate your time, and I think Atiya, you did do a great job of bringing together the panel. And thank you, everybody.
And just very quickly, again, I echo my co-panelists and thanking everyone for your time this morning. I'm delighted to be on the panel. Thank you so much for having me. I hope that among a number of things we did this morning that we were able to underscore the value and the benefit of having a chief diversity officer in your organization. And so perhaps you have one now and you're thinking about adding some different elements and dimensions to their role, or maybe you don't have one and you were on the fence, and hopefully we've convinced you that you should have one. Some notes that I jotted down here, different ways to describe a chief diversity officer. We talked about a CDO being an advocate, being a disruptor, being a team builder, being a coach, and being an influencer. Absolutely critical and can totally add value to any organization. Thank you so much.
I thank you all, and I'm just honored that I was asked to moderate this dynamic panel. I am so excited. I was excited when I was asked to be here. I was excited every time I speak to my team members, which are over at the table over there, RWJ. But to be a part of the disruptors, right? And to have leadership that is willing to take the risk and understand that disruption is necessary is what I enjoy and what pulls at my heart to do the work that I do every single day, to influence the way we work, interact, and embrace diversity and inclusion. So I thank you all for today, this morning. And at this time, I'd like to bring Jeff back up to the front.
Thank you, Atiya. Thank you, Lloyd Freeman, Elaine Katz, Armond Kinsey, and Avonia Richardson-Miller. Please look for an account of these proceedings later today on NJBIZ.com and expanded coverage in our next print edition, which is dated August 5th. We'll also post a video of the entire session on our YouTube channel in about a week or so, about a week. That'll be available there. Kane AV takes care of all of that. They do a great job. If you want more information about Kane, please stop by the registration desk. If you can, please join us at our next discussion on healthcare technology. That's August 27th here at the Doubletree. I hope to see you there. Thanks for coming, everyone.